And I'm back. Just waiting for John Sternfeld to join again. We had some technical difficulties, but we're back. I hope everyone's having a good day. Hey, Jill. We're just waiting for John to come back. Quan, what's going on, brother? Happy holidays to you all. We're just waiting for John to come back. There he is.
Well, I'm grateful too, Jill. Stay up on me. I have some surprises coming up.
Hello. Sorry about that.
Yeah. How are you, brother?
Good. I appreciate it. Yeah, it's my first IG Live, and I didn't have the app. So thank
I
you for
feel honored to
tolerating
be.
that.
I feel honored to be your first IG live.
Yeah, I
This is
think
exciting.
maybe I watched one, but no, I've never been part of one. So I appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay, nice, nice, nice. So I wanted to have you on because I've been listening to "Scenes from My Life" by Michael K. Williams, and it was very impactful. And it just so happens that I did a post about it, and you retweeted my post on Twitter.
Yeah.
And with that, uh, and this happens a lot with me because of your activity. I consider you like a live feed, so I
Okay.
jumped on you the chance. So I was like,
Yeah.
"Whoa, he's active. Maybe I can see if I can get an interview out of him." In case you guys don't know, Michael K. Williams did a book. It's called "Scenes from My Life," and Mr. John Sternfeld here is the co-author. Now, in I guess in some parts it says ghostwriter, but
Yeah.
I don't.
Ghostwriter's
How do
like
you
a
understand
blanket
that term?
term. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Give us
ghostwriter is a
the term.
blanket term. It's kind of dated, but it just means someone who helps someone with a book. It doesn't mean like
Okay.
you write it all under their name. Ghostwriter, like people use collaborator now a lot more.
Okay.
But it just
Okay.
means like most people, if they get a book deal, if they are not a writer, work with
Hmm.
somebody. Could be an
Okay.
editor, could be a ghostwriter, could be a collaborator. They could pay them a bunch of money to be quiet about it, but it
Okay.
happens.
All
Mike,
right.
from the beginning, was like, no, you're working with me on the book. I'm going to put your name on the cover. So I appreciated that.
Okay. Absolutely. And thank you for that education
Yeah.
because I didn't know. So I wanted to have you on because, of course, Michael K. Williams, we lost him, and he is no longer around to promote the book. But because you helped write it, who better else to promote the book but you?
Right, which is strange because I never do any promotion for any books I work on. So it
Uh,
sort of asked me to step into Mike's shoes, which are obviously gigantic shoes.
yeah.
And I admit I said no. I was like, I'm
Mhm.
not comfortable with that. But it became clear that when a book comes out, they need someone to book interviews. And Mike was
Yeah.
not around. And by saying no, I was hurting the book. So immediately once I realized that, I said, okay, sign me up. I talked to whoever wanted to talk about Mike, and I do my best to not channel him, but know what he would say in this context, right? So I'm not here
Okay.
as myself.
Okay. So I applaud this process because I didn't go through a manager, I didn't go through a publicist. I went directly to you, and I
Mhm.
thank you for agreeing to be a part of this forum. Welcome.
I appreciate it. And I would even say the Twitter thing was something Mike would have done. I knew Mike well enough that if he saw people on Twitter, somebody posted like, oh, when I get my next paycheck, I'm going to buy the book. I sent them
Mhm.
a book. Like I tried like, what was Mike about and how did
Yeah.
Mike treat people? And not that I'm not a nice person, but Mike was so giving and so generous that it's like if I saw you complimenting the book, I would say, yeah, of course, I'd be happy to talk about it.
Yeah. I never met Mike, but I produced and I'm on another show called the Stephen Knight Show, and we had him on there as a guest, and he was so
Yes,
warm and
I caught a
open.
clip of that. Yeah.
Yeah. So he's really a good dude, and I got a chance through the book to know a little bit more about him. So yeah. So let's start with you. Let's start back to I guess your youth.
My
What
youth.
made you want? Yeah, your youth. What made you want to be a writer?
I don't think I ever did want to be a writer. I think I was a big reader, and I was attracted to the arts, but I never saw it as like a career path. And
Mm-hmm.
yeah, so I majored in writing in college, but those people, we always end up being teachers. So like when I got
Mm-hmm.
out of college, like, you going to teach? And I was like, I eventually taught in a public high school in New Rochelle for about 5 years. And I realized that I just wanted to be in the book world. There's like a big book room in the school. It's a giant school. So I would go
Mm-hmm.
into the book room and I would hang out. They got like 200 copies of every book. And I was like, something tells me I want to be closer to books. So I sort of made my way into publishing that way. That's how I ended up there.
So, because also, I'm big on inspiration, and people may be watching this who have inspiration to be in the arts some way, somehow, but they just don't know how to do it. Talk a little bit about your journey and how you formulated your path.
It's a great question. I mean, I was 29 years old, newly married when I quit teaching. And I realized I had to willingly work somewhere for free. There's no way into publishing if you're competing against 22-year-olds to get a good job right away. So I just had to suck it up. I talked to my wife and I said, I'm going to have to intern somewhere. I was a 30-year-old intern at a literary agency because I found in
Mm-hmm.
publishing that literary agencies are the easiest way in. The editing jobs, like the big editing jobs at Random House, they are so coveted and they are so difficult to get that I found basically a back door into the industry. And that was working for free at a literary agency. I worked my ass off and they offered me a job. So I basically started as an agent. I wasn't good at it. I didn't really have an affinity for the business side, but I learned a lot and I met a lot of people. And then I got
Yeah.
an editing job from there. And then from the editing job, I got offered my first ghostwriting job. So everything
Okay.
sort of slowly worked me closer.
So, and this is important. Would you say that the biggest part of your internship will be with the relationships that you made?
Oh, absolutely. Right. Because at the
Yeah.
end of the day, think about who you want to work with. Like if somebody comes to work at the Stephen Knight show, yeah, you're looking for talent and experience, but basically like, do I want to spend every day with this person? Does this
Mm-hmm.
person inspire me to do well?
Mm-hmm.
I did. I absolutely made close relationships there. So even though agenting wasn't for me, everyone was willing to help me out. And now as a ghostwriter, I get jobs from those same agents because they know me and they know what I'm about, and I try to be a positive, inclusive person. But absolutely, and I think that I don't want to judge other interns, but I've done internships. I did them when I was younger, and sometimes there's this sense of entitlement about it, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
I'm working for free, you should respect me, but nobody wants to deal with that, right? What you want to deal with is someone who's offering of themselves. And I tried to do that, and I lucked out because when my internship was over, the woman who ran the agency just made me an agent. I didn't have to pass a test. I didn't have to do like she was just like, you could do it, and that was it. So
Yeah.
I started. So I was given the benefit of the doubt because I tried to bring positive energy to it. I mean, I was 30 years old. I had no office. I had my laptop. I would go into Union Square Park, and I would read the slush pile. And if you don't know, the slush pile is if you submit a book to an agent, but you don't
Mm-hmm.
know anybody, you basically just email the agency. And
Mm-hmm.
that inbox, which accumulates somewhere between 100 and 300 emails a day, is called the
Wow.
slush. It's called the slush pile. And there's always someone at an agency who checks in on the slush pile. That's what I did. Occasionally, you find something really worthy that might sell as a book, but mostly you don't. But what you do is you learn to read quickly. You learn to judge quickly. You learn to ask yourself questions quickly. So thousands and thousands and thousands of those eventually developed that muscle for me. Yeah, I kind of loved it, even though it was a weird situation. And I was happy to learn the industry from people who wanted to teach it. So shout out.
Okay. And so after your internship ends and you become an agent, talk to me about the agent job. What does that consist of?
Basically, you are now in charge of signing people and then selling their book to publishers. So I still had access to the slush pile, but I
Mm-hmm.
also would meet with editors, right? You go to lunch with editors, you find out what they're into, they recognize your name. So then you find this great young writer from Ohio, and he's written short stories in a literary magazine that you've read. You find out if he has a novel idea, right? And then you help him with the pitch, and then you try to sell it to a publisher or a nonfiction idea. But you're basically like the medium between Penguin Random House, Harper, all those big places, and the world. So you're kind
Yes.
of an important gateway, because someone at Random House doesn't have time to go. I mean, some of them do, but they don't have time to hunt. They have their own books. Your job as
Right.
an agent is to hunt, read literary magazine, read the back of like contest winners in journals,
Mm.
listen to NPR, right? Find
Yeah.
a story, like all of that. It's just like the hunt. And there are so many talented people. And if you're in New York City, you're likely to run into 2 or 3 talented people a day. And some of them
Mm.
are now. So that's basically what I did. And that was almost 3 years of that.
So at what point in being an agent do you decide that you need to put your finger to the keys and create for yourself?
Well, I think what it was is I wasn't making enough money. So an agent doesn't work on salary. So I wasn't making enough money. My wife wanted to have a kid. So I became an editor at like a mid-tier press up in Connecticut. And
Mm-hmm.
then you're acquiring the books, right? So you are working hands-on on the manuscripts. You have a writer, they send it to you. Sometimes it's a great clean manuscript that doesn't need much, and sometimes it's a mess. So you
Mm-hmm.
spend time working with them to develop the book, and then you publish it, right? You decide what
Mm-hmm.
size it's going to be. You send it to the printer. You do all that nitty-gritty that as an agent I didn't know anything about. I would sell a book as an agent, and 2 years later it would show up in a box, published, right? Like I didn't.
Yeah.
So it was like I'm like drilling into the center of how books work. And I
Right.
loved that. I really did. And I spent 2 years on that. And from one of those jobs, I got offered a ghostwriting job, even though I had never done it. It was just a totally fortuitous. Someone whose book I edited called me, said they were friendly with a couple of senators who wanted to write a book together. Would I be
Mm-hmm.
interested in doing it? And I said, yeah, of course. And that was it. And then that job led to another. And now I think I just did my 17th book. So
Wow.
just been very fortunate that each book has rolled into the next one.
That's very nice, and I like the way that you laid everything out, because a part of this platform and why I do what I do is also to educate people and inspire other people in case this may be their path,
Right.
and it's educational for them. So what does it feel like to find out that you're on a New York Times bestseller list?
It was pretty freaking exciting. I had never been on the list. I had never planned on being on the list, but it was also really bittersweet because my editor
Mm-hmm.
called me to tell me, and for 5 seconds, we're like, oh my God. And then it's like, but Mike should be enjoying this. This was Mike's
Right.
story, Mike's voice. I could see Mike getting a huge kick out of that. I mean, it would make him feel so validated. So every positive review or positive response to Mike's book has been, I don't know if you've ever saw Inside Out, the
Yes.
Pixar movie. You know how they learned
Yes.
that all the joy has a little sadness in it? Like
Yep.
that's what it's been like. Every time it's like colored with Mike's presence. So it was incredible news, but also like just unfair, unfair because his death was accidental, unfair because he had so much more to give. But yeah, we were really proud of him and excited.
So talk to me about the onset of Michael into your life. Like, tell me about the beginning when you two guys started formulating, which turned out to be this masterpiece of a book.
Thank you for saying that. It was a long process. Mike got in touch through his agent, Susan Gollum. He and his nephew, Dominic, who I think is maybe here visiting, they met with me, and they had been screening a documentary that Mike had made through HBO called Raised in, and it was Dominic's story. Dominic served almost 20 years in prison and then was given clemency. And Mike was learning about mostly the juvenile justice world, visiting facilities, meeting with alternative programs, judges who were trying to give kids a second chance. Like it became a second job for Mike. And
Right.
at the end of that year of screenings, they wanted to write a book together. So they met with me. We were going to start basically focused on social justice. It was not going to be a memoir of Mike's life. It was going to be mostly about this work he'd been doing in the community. And over time, Mike started sharing so many different stories about his childhood and his mother and abuse and acting and trauma and dancing. And like, it was so much and it was so rich that at some point I pitched to his manager and him, we should tell people your story. The story is amazing. I know that social justice is your focus and we can make sure that's part of the book. But to leave this stuff on the cutting room floor is crazy. And he eventually agreed. He agreed not because he wanted to glorify himself. He was never about that. But he understood how his pain shared could help others. And he was in touch
Right.
with that. And, you know, when you sell a book, maybe 10,000, 20,000, 50,000 people are going to read it. So he
Right.
saw the book as like a tool to share his pain and his trauma and his hopes. And I'm so glad he agreed to do it. Of course, we didn't know he was going to pass. But
Right.
I bet you if we could talk to him, he'd be glad that he got that all down because he was able
Yeah.
to get that out there. So that was it. So the book, you know, from when we agreed to first meet to when Mike passed was 2.5 years, which is actually pretty long for me. I usually work maybe a year and a half because Mike was a busy guy. He was
Yeah.
in demand in Hollywood and he was in demand from the community. And he said yes to everything for no money. He gave himself on like an individual level. I don't mean like photo ops. I mean like this individual kid in Ohio or Pittsburgh needs him. And will you get on the phone with him? I mean, that kind of stuff is time consuming. So to get the book down took a long time. And then he passed about 6 weeks before it was due to turn in. So he and I had worked on most of it when he had passed away.
Mm. And in hearing that news, I guess I want to know, it's a two-part answer. I want to know how that affected you, and I want to know how that affected um, the literary community as it related to this pending book that was coming out.
Right. Let's see. So it was Labor Day last year, 2021. I was playing with my son in the backyard, and Mike's manager, Matt, who was more than a manager, like he called and told me, and you know, I was just sort of dumbfounded. I don't even know what I thought, but it was total shock. I had talked to Mike on Friday, but this was a Monday. Yeah, and it was awful. And then soon after Matt called, and I appreciated him calling, it hit the wires. So
Mm.
I didn't go on the internet, but everyone knew I was writing a book with Mike. So everybody was texting me, and it was overwhelming. I've never, you know, I've lost my parents, but it wasn't in the news. You know, it wasn't something that you're reading. It's all surreal. It's surreal when you lose someone, and then when that someone's a public figure, it's very bizarre.
Mhm.
But I took, you know, I want to say like a week, and you know, the agents are calling and the editors are calling, and I said I just needed some time, right? And then at some point, somebody was saying, well, if the book's not finished, maybe we could do something else.
Mm.
Once I heard that, I kind of freaked because the whole point is that Mike wanted this book. And I immediately shut that down. And I said, no, the book is going to come out exactly as Mike wanted it. I need a little bit more time, but I have all these taped interviews, you know, 20 plus hours of interviews. I will figure it out. So once the personal grieving and the dealing with the book sort of happened simultaneously last year, and it was a strange time. I sought out the help of some people in Mike's circle to fill in some gaps. So
Okay.
the rule I had was if Mike hadn't told me a story, I was not going to put it in the book. But there were a lot of stories that like the dialogue wasn't filled in.
Mhm.
So like Dominic would be an example. I called up Dominic and I'd say, Dominic, Mike told a story about visiting you up in prison, and he said this, that, and Dominic would help with the other side of that.
Okay.
I did that like maybe 8 or 10 times with various people mentioned in the book, and some of them got on the phone and they were just, you know, they were crying. Like the process was me just sitting and listening. I think people appreciated a chance to share stories of Mike, but it was very raw. It was relatively soon after he passed. I wanted people to know that like I was only reaching out because we want to put out the book Mike wants, but I felt weird. I didn't want to feel like a vulture, you know, bothering. So I did that, and I was able to fill in some gaps in the book. Yeah, and I would say the book was, you know, Mike approved 75% of it, and the other 25%, he was aware of the outline. So in the end, I'm just sort of filling in gaps. And it was strange because I had to listen back to the tapes of Mike, and that was very painful. I was seeing his face everywhere, but I was used to seeing his face from The Wire before I knew him. But his
Yeah.
voice was very personal to me. I could picture him on the other end of my phone. So listening to those tapes was really tough. Some days I would, you know, I just didn't want to do it, but I had to. And But I felt like communing with somebody who, it was like communing with someone who was no longer with us and getting his story out there. And I felt this like big obligation to get it right. And so that's what that was. That was a couple months of doing that. And then I turned it in, and that was it.
Talk to me a little bit about your experience with Michael K. Williams, the man, as you knew him, because I'm sure being so close and sharing so much, you developed a friendship, I'm
Yeah.
sure. Talk to me about him as a man and your friend.
He was really remarkable. You know, I try to remember what I thought of him before I knew him, you know, based on Omar and Chalky White. And, you know, he was kind of a teddy bear. He was soft. He would admit he was soft. He had so much love and excitement for like other people's successes. Like he would get on the phone. When we had interviews, like for the book, the first 10 minutes was him telling me about this news story he saw and this kid he ran into and this program that he and Dana Racklin are starting. And I mean, the joy coming out of him because he felt himself being impactful. And then he would sort of take a big breath and say, okay, what are we talking about today? And then we might have talked about his dad or, you know, getting kicked out of schools or rehab. So what I got to know about him was he was an extremely generous soul. He was very gracious, and he got his energy from other people's successes and joy. He didn't like publicizing himself. Like he recognized he was a known figure, but he never liked talking about it unless it was going to help him get something done. Right? Like I remember referring once to him being like one of HBO's All-Stars or something about Mount Rushmore. And he was like, he had never even heard that. That was like not interesting to him. What he wanted to know was, now that I have all this spotlight on me, what can we do about it? And that was going to be what the rest of his life was going to be like. I mean, he had really committed himself to being both an entertainer, but also a voice and an activist for the forgotten. Sorry, my dog.
It's okay.
And I think that at the end of the day, there are nice people in the world and there are kind people in the world. But Mike was sort of a superhero of generosity and graciousness. And it clearly was not what he was always like. He admitted in his 20s he was a knucklehead and all that kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, he gained energy from other people's success. And that inspired me because I cannot say that I'm that kind of person, right? I have my life and I have my kids and I have my world, just like most people. And spending time with Mike gets you to open up in a way. And I was hoping to put that energy into the book because that's what talking to him was like. You'd hang up the phone and be like, God damn, I'm doing nothing with myself. This guy's busier than everybody I know. And he still has time for random kids and organizations. And it blew me away. 1 second. I'm sorry. My dog's going to make noise until I deal with him.
Okay.
Oh, thank you. I'm on an IG live and he's making noise. Thank you. That's the real world of the writer. So obviously, you know, I'm gonna say this kind of stuff anyway, but I try to communicate to people that this is really what he was like. In a very rare way, his positive energy came from the way he fed off others, right? But I think there's a dark side to that. You know, I would be remiss if I didn't say when you're that open to the world, when you're that open to people, other things get in. And Mike was very obvious about that. You know, we would be on the phone sometimes and people would walk up to him on the street and just start talking. And 10 minutes later, I'd be like, do you know that guy? He's like, no. He just wanted to, you're right. So there's the positive side of that. But of course, you can imagine, anybody can imagine how if you're an addict, right, who's trying to stay clean, or you're in Baltimore and you're like a big celebrity in Baltimore and you're trying not to drink or you're trying not to smoke, or you could see how all of that negative energy can also get in there. And I think that happened too. And he was open about that happening.
Yeah. Were there any conversations that you had that you saw him maybe have difficulty telling, or maybe he had a breakdown in reliving it while he was talking to you?
That happened a lot. Yeah. Talking about his mother, who was a complicated person. He would revisit things she said or did to him when he was 12 years old, and he would tear up about that. Talking about witnessing violence, whether it was a friend. He told this story about his friend Maurice, who died in Vanderveer. It's in the book. He told this, he mentioned it in different contexts, and every time you could tell he was reliving it in his head. And even random violence. There's a story in the book about him going to see a movie and somebody getting killed in the movie theater. Comes out and he's trying to light his joint, and his hands are shaking. And he told the story, and then he called me back and he said, you know what's funny about that story is I've told that story as a joke 500 times. But when I was telling it to you, I realized that my hands were shaking because I was traumatized. And I said, yeah. And he's like, I was talking to my nephew Dominic, and he said, that story's really effed up. And he's like, yeah, but he had developed almost like this screen to block it out. And one of his interests was getting especially young people to drop that screen, because he saw that screen as normalizing the abnormal. And he would talk regularly about, we have to stop normalizing the abnormal. But people survive how they survive. They survive with jokes. They survive with misdirection. And his maturity process was about dragging down those screens because it was leading to more trauma because people were not addressing their shit. That's what he would say. Address your shit.
It's so ironic that you bring that up, because yesterday I had a interview with Ricardo Grimm, who knew Michael.
Yeah.
And we were having that very same conversation about the trauma that we're under, but never gets processed because we normalize it. And when we normalize it, it gets tucked away and it gets embedded into the day-to-day, which is not normal.
Right.
And sometimes it takes someone from the outside to shine a flashlight on it to tell you, or for you to see that it's not normal.
Right. And he would talk about it, the Black community. He would say it, like, my community, where I'm from, the way we paper things over in order to get to the next day. It's understandable. He wasn't judging anybody for doing it, but he was saying this feedback loop is the problem, the way we're normalizing the abnormal. And his one of his passion projects was to point it out. There's a scene in the book with a young person who Mike was close with. He went to his graduation. And the kid at the celebration dinner was going through Instagram. And he's part of an Instagram group where when people are killed in the neighborhood, it goes up on Instagram. So if you want to see if people are alive, you could scroll on this feed. And Mike's head exploded when he saw that. Like, he couldn't believe, but the kid was doing it like, oh, let's see if any of my homies is on here. And Mike made a point of sitting with him and saying, this is not normal. It is not normal to treat the death of loved ones or even the death of acquaintances so casually. And he wanted to get people to dig into that. And he had thousands of those stories. That was one of his missions,
Wow. Did he ever mention that speaking with you was cathartic for him?
Oh, sure. Yeah. He said that all the time. He said it was like going to therapy. He said it was cathartic. He would say, after I got off the phone with you, I had to talk to my sponsor. And, I try not to feed into that because I'm not a professional. But yeah, he would say that all the time. And I also got the sense that when he was going through stuff, he didn't want to talk to me. When he went down to Atlanta to shoot Lovecraft Country, he had a relapse that he talked about publicly. And I didn't know about it because he wasn't answering my texts. And then later, he basically let me know through his way that he had gone through some things and he had to get back into the program and talk to his sponsor. So he sort of avoided the spotlight. And I think for 2 years, I was a type of spotlight. I'm sure it was like that with his friends and his manager too. And I tried not to pry. It was his life and his business, but he would share about it. He would talk about how he got so close to roles that it would sort of feed at him from the inside out. Anybody who's watched Mike act knows that he brings this extra, almost supernatural vibe to his characters where you just feel him in a way you don't, even the best actors, you don't feel it the way you feel it from Mike. And I got to hear from Mike how he does that. And it's very much like inhabiting it and releasing it out as if it were from the inside. But that does a number on you, right? That does a number on you. And he had, 30 years of doing that, and it had worn him down. Absolutely had worn him down. And then I would say stuff like, well, Mike, I mean, why don't you stop? You know, like we would not be talking about the book. I would be like, and he would say, no, this is what I'm here for. This is my light. This is my engine. He understood that inhabiting these characters was part of the work. It was not separate from it. And
Yeah.
he was getting to a place where he was going to exert his power a lot more in Hollywood. And he was more open about producing and speaking up. And, you know, he had so much more to give. So.
Wow. And how did you walk away from that experience with him in listening to all those stories? How did it affect you?
Well, I never walked away from it because even talking to you now, I still feel them. I think it changed me. You know, it's very self-serving for me to say it. And I did an interview where I said it and they made it like the headline. I didn't mean it like that. I just meant he impacted so many people and he impacted me. And now when I go into my work or my family or the outside world or anything, I have this sort of Mike part of my brain that gives more than I would normally give, is more accepting. I'm less quick to judge. You know, obviously I still do it, but he had a really positive impact on me because he had no reason to be as selfless as he was, right? He had given so much. He'd had so much bad things happen to him. He easily could have just done his Hollywood work, hung out with his friends, and been good, and no one would have judged him. But he chose not to, and that's inspiring. And we could all do a different version of that in our own lives. So that's what I take away from him, definitely.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask you something, and I mean no offense by it. I'm just curious. Is this the most dialogue that you've had in like in an intimate way with someone of color, like with Mike?
You mean right now or with Mike?
With Mike.
Oh, no, that's a good question. I mean, I would say I've written other books with African Americans, including the book that got me Mike's job. The Mike was friends with this activist named Jim St. Germain, whose book, right? So my conversations with Jim, which was one of my first books, absolutely was the most dialogue I'd had. So yes. So when I talked to Mike those 2.5 years, yeah, I don't have a lot of people of color with my life. What's even stranger than that, when you ask that, I would even say this press tour for Mike's book has been the most, because a lot of the interviewers have been people of color. And I wonder if they're thinking, like, I almost wanted to tell you, like, you know that I'm white, right? But I realized that I'm not going to bother telling you. But I wanted people to know that, like, I'm from the opposite of this world. You know, I'm a white Jewish kid from the suburbs. So I don't think it's offensive at all. But I think that's part, when we talk about how Mike has impacted me, we can't separate the fact that he was black, but also from a poor black neighborhood and for the black experience. Like all those things, yeah, absolutely. Had a huge impact on me because I don't have, in my neighborhood, there's not many black people. Beside my brother's wife is black, but besides her, they're not in my world. And talking to Mike helped introduce me to larger parts of that world. And I'm grateful for that.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you were comfortable in sharing that. And just based off the state of the world and what's going on now, and I think that's important because we're all in this together and no one gets out alive.
That's right.
And we're all able to learn from one another if we would just open up and have some consideration and understanding.
Absolutely. And that, you know, that's one of Mike's mantras, was the idea that we are more similar than we are different. And he made a point to say, like, I'm talking for the forgotten black kids, but I'm also talking for, you know, the white Jewish kids and the Hispanic kids. Like, he made a point to say, like, yeah, I speak from my experience, but I know how universal it is. And that itself is, it's like a thing politicians say, or it's a thing that celebrities say, but Mike really meant it. And you could tell the difference when it's coming from someone who meant it. So, yeah, I absolutely agree that the universality, especially, you know, the pandemic and the George Floyd reaction, that all happened right around the time that Mike and I were working on the book. And I could feel how much it affected him. And he would talk about that first summer of 2020, how it was going to hurt the hood. You know, and he used to say that when white people get a cold, black people get pneumonia. That was like one of his, and he knew that funding was going to be cut and kids were not going into school, which meant they were on top of each other. And he like foresaw all this violence that was going to happen in the hood that summer. And it really got to him. Like, he really spoke about it and was trying with Dana Racklin to get programs off the ground to make up for the shortfall. And these are things that was not part of his world. I mean, Mike lived in a penthouse in Williamsburg. He could have ignored all that, but he would not have felt right. So, he got out there during COVID, during the protests, during the election for mayor. He was out there really putting his voice to the ground in a way that was inspiring as well.
And I like the way that he said that he was out there in the beginning, like especially with like Obama.
Yep.
He was out there in the beginning, but he had no idea what he was doing.
Yep.
But he knew that there was a different calling for him to be in that space. And eventually he began to own it, but
Yeah, but he admitted that his ignorance, say ignorance, around the time of Obama's arrival was what triggered him, because he was shocked. Like, when Obama started talking about Omar, that blew Mike's mind. And then he realized, like, oh my God, I exist beyond this small little world of in HBO shows. And that was really the engine that got him thinking larger. But he would also say one of the engines was the DUI arrest. So if you haven't read the book, Mike, in the last year of The Wire, was arrested for 2 DUIs, and he was sentenced to community service. And he wanted to actually do community service, right? So he worked it out with the lawyers and the judge to go to high schools and basically talk about being an addict and his childhood and his trouble and his trauma. And the kids responded to him. And it was from that, which was right around the time of Obama's election, that gave Mike this larger sense of who he was. And he carried that up until the day he died. But it was triggered by that. It was triggered by being very insular. He would talk about being an addict. Like, you literally, it's like the world is tiny when you're an addict, right? It's just you're in a room, you have your drugs. And Obama mentioning his name and then going into these high schools, exploded his world in a very positive way.
Yeah, and also how he shared he didn't feel like he had a choice to do anything else because he felt like a fraud if he did anything else.
That's right. Yeah. That's exactly right. He had to be true to himself, and he would not be able to operate. He would not be able to operate out of bullshit. He was just not capable of doing it. And it got me thinking a lot when I was working on the book. That's why he was such a fucking good actor, right? Because he, all the things that formed his personality, he brought into the art. And anybody who's ever watched a performance of his on screen, it has a believability, but that comes from him actually caring about it, right? You can't fake that stuff. He knew that.
Even that whole story that was shared about when he was shooting the video and he was rubbing the fabric across his face and he started feeling a certain type of way.
Yes.
And then that was the first time that he ever brought his real life into his acting life. And the director loved it. And then he realized that the marriage was what he needed to do in order to bring.
That's right. I was at Taylor Day in video. I think it was from '93. And he was basically a model and a dancer. And then he started getting, especially after his scar, which it's funny, we've been talking for 45 minutes. We didn't talk about the scar across Mike's face, which, in his mind changed his life. He started getting speaking roles. And during one of the videos, he started crying, but he didn't know he was allowed to cry. So he actually held it in. This is in the book. And he mentioned to the director, he almost cried. And the director's like, well, why did you cry? And he's like, that would have been cool. I would have been allowed to do that. And yeah, exactly. That was the gateway. Like, oh, if I could get some lines, I could probably turn this into something. But he hadn't considered it. And a lot of it was, there was a place for his pain to go to, right? His pain was circling in him. And sometimes it went into his addiction, and sometimes it went into relationships. But he had this outlet, and it was dance that was his outlet for joy, and then acting was his outlet for these sort of traumatic things that were still bubbling inside of him.
And then even what he shared about being African American and being male, and I can attest to this too. We're not reared to express ourselves that way. If you have sorrow, you have some type of pain, you tuck it away. It's you survive, you stay stoic, and you move forward. Tuck it away and move forward.
Absolutely. I mean, that was one of his big things, right? And he would talk about chatting with teenagers who were behind bars, you know, and he could see them trying to hold things in, and he would always say it's okay to cry, or he would hug them, or he would talk about loving on them. And that was all like a very concerted effort from Mike to get these young people, and yes, mostly young Black people, to accept that their pain was not something to be hidden. And part was because they felt guilty. If someone abuses you, you think it's your fault. If your parents divorce, you think it's your fault. So he would talk about there's nothing for us to hide. We should not feel guilty. If we all knew how many of us were walking around with pain, a lot of the conflicts would be avoided, right? So that was one of his main missions, was getting especially kids of color, male kids of color, to express their pain and be open about their pain. And he would do it by talking about his own. And the tragedies of Mike not being able to do publicity about this book is because his voice on this exact issue really would have reached so many people. You know, I appreciate everyone who's talked to me, but I'm only going to reach so many people, right? But if Mike were here and he could cry on camera and talk about the way his mother treated him when he was 9 and how it still got to him, and the way he cried for joy when his nephew got out of prison, and how he felt very vulnerable and soft, and he was okay with that, and you know, all that stuff over and over and over again, not just in the book, but in the months after the book came out, that could have done a lot of good, right? And that's part of the tragedy in here.
Yeah, but I think everything happens for a reason, and I think that this reason is to be foretold. Like it's still enveloping on why he's not here to be able to tell this story. I want to give you your flowers. You know, we've been talking about Mike because this is his project. But brother, I have to tell you, in reading, well, I did the Audible, so I was hearing those stories. I saw everything. It was like I was watching a movie, and that has to do with the brilliance of your pen to paper, your
really
skill set.
And we got to give credit to the narrator, who is Dion Graham, who did that. And you know, Mike was going to do the audiobook, but that's done late in the process. And Dion Graham does such a good job. He doesn't imitate Mike, but he like channels his spirit. And I listened to the book, and I was blown away with how like you forget it's not Mike, right? And he did it.
In all honesty, I was going to say, in all honesty, I think I was more than halfway through, and I've gotten so used to his voice that I'm hearing the story, and I'm like, and I actually had a thought. I was like, this isn't Michael? Like, I knew that it wasn't, but I forgot that it wasn't. Yeah.
Right, exactly. I mean, he could not have done a better job with that. I count listening to books as reading, so I don't see any distinction. But he also does a good job of, it's funny because there are things that Dion Graham says in the book that I remember Mike saying to me, like word for word. And if, as the co-writer of the book, you get me forgetting it's not Mike, like that's a transcendent job. So he deserves credit. That was one of the motivations in getting the book right. When Mike was alive, I thought he was going to read it. So I remember thinking that like every line had to sound exactly like him. And if Michael K. Williams' voice is very well known, and if there was one false note, it'd be like playing a wrong note on a piano. So going through it over and over again, like I would make sure, like, would you say it like this? And he would help me change it, because that kind of thing will take you out of it like that. So that was a big part of when we would bounce it off of each other.
Yeah. Brother, you did awesome work. What are you working on now?
I'm working on a book. I'm not really even allowed to talk about it, but it's with a police whistleblower. So somebody in the police department who is trying to blow the whistle on racial profiling, on quotas, on the way the Black community is unfairly targeted. He has not come out as the author, so I'm not allowed to say anything, but that'll be coming out next year. And he, you know, he will obviously do promotion for that. But I think about the way that my experience with Mike has paid it forward into these other conversations, and the way that even talking to this police officer, the way that my interactions with Mike have helped me, like it helped lay the groundwork for me being more open to different things. So appreciate Mike for putting me in that headspace, you know.
That's awesome. Well, Mr. Sternfeld, you have a new fan in me. I'll be following you and attaching myself to everything that you are associated with. Just simply because you delivered something where you helped Michael deliver something that seemed like therapy for me. And just listening to it, it helped me. So I'm sure anyone that absorbs this, and if you haven't read the book or heard the book, Scenes of My from My Life by Michael K. Williams, please check it out. It is more than worth its weight in gold. Very, very filled with nutrients for your soul and your spirit.
Well said. And thank you so much for having me and giving me a chance to talk about
Oh,
Mike.
thank you for coming. You know, I listen. I am so honored that you're here.
Well, absolutely. And, I'll be following you as well. So good luck to you. I think this is a great show, and I'll be watching other episodes right away.
Are there any people that you want to shout out? Anybody that you want to, just...
Well, I think I mentioned both of them. I saw Dominic DuPont, who's Mike's nephew, who's really been the carrier of Mike's legacy, who was also instrumental in helping to promote the book. And Dana Racklin, who's Mike's activist partner. I would shout out her organization, which she co-founded with Mike, is called We Build the Block. So if you wanted to donate or volunteer, We Build the Block was a community organization that Mike was heavily involved in. You can go to their website and get involved. So I would shout both of them out.
Okay, absolutely. And where can people find you if they want to follow you?
I'm on Twitter at John Sternfeld, no H. I do have a website and I do have an Instagram. So my name, I'm around, and a lot of stuff lately has just been getting the book out to Mike's fans and readers. So you'll always see Mike content on my various things. So I try to get his face and his voice out there as much as I can.
Mr. Sternfeld, I appreciate you, and good luck to you in your future, and thank you for the art.
All right. Thank you so much. I appreciate you. Thanks.
All
Bye.
right. Take care.